let's unlock the story of a civilization that was, in many ways, the key to ancient Rome. They were a powerhouse in the Mediterranean for centuries, and then, well, it's like they just vanished. We're talking about the Etruscans, and their story is one of antiquity's greatest and most fascinating mysteries. So who exactly were these people? Well, imagine this. They were masters of engineering, art, and religion who literally gave Rome some of its most famous symbols and rituals. But for centuries, their language was a total puzzle, and their origins were a complete mystery. In this explainer, we're going to piece together all the clues to figure out who the Etruscans really were.
For something like 700 years, the Etruscans were the dominant force on the Italian peninsula, right from their home base in modern-day Tuscany. They were incredible traders, artists, and warriors. But here's the thing. Their story doesn't really have a clear beginning or a simple end. It's this incredibly complex mix of culture, influence, and eventually getting absorbed into the very empire they helped build.
Okay, so to crack this case, here's our game plan. We're going to start with that big old question of where they came from. Then we'll dive into their unique society and what they believed. After that, we'll uncover their secret role as Rome's architects, investigate their lost language, and finally, we'll deliver the verdict on their lasting legacy. First up, the origin mystery. Now, for more than 2,000 years, a theory from the Greek historian Herodotus was basically the only story we had. But in the 21st century, modern science, specifically archaeogenetics, has totally flipped the script. And this is where things get really interesting. For literally millennia, the story was that a huge famine drove the Etruscans all the way from Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, to Italy. It's a great story. But then, a groundbreaking 2021 genetic study of Etruscan tombs revealed something completely different. They were genetically the same as their Latin-speaking neighbors. They were locals. And this new evidence is it's so powerful. The science is crystal clear on this one. There was no mass migration from Anatolia. The Etruscans were Italians, through and through, their genetic roots planted right here in the soil for centuries. You see, the Etruscans were part of this wider genetic story in Italy. They shared ancestry with groups that came from the huge grasslands north of the Black Sea way back in the Bronze Age. But, solving one mystery just creates another one. If they were genetically the same as their neighbors, then why was their culture, and especially their language, so incredibly different?
And that question, well, it leads us right to their unique culture. We've established they weren't outsiders, so what was it that made them so distinct? It really all comes down to their society and their beliefs about how the universe worked. So the Etruscans weren't some single, unified kingdom. No, they were more like a league of super wealthy city-states, each one ruled by a powerful elite. Their money came from Tuscany's rich mineral deposits and from controlling sea trade routes, and they invested a lot of that wealth in the afterlife, creating these massive cities of the dead, just filled with amazing art. These tombs weren't just graves, they were meant to be eternal homes, projecting power forever.
But what really, truly defined them was their religion. The Romans were just in awe of it. The Etrusca Disciplina was like a sacred science, basically a rule book for reading the will of the gods in things like lightning strikes, the flight of birds, or even the organs of sacrificed animals. This intense focus on ritual and divination, it would be heavily borrowed by their neighbors, and it ended up shaping the very core of Roman religious life.
Which brings us to our next big clue. We often think of Rome as this totally self-made empire, right? But the truth is, a ton of its foundational culture was inherited from the Etruscans. They were, in a lot of ways, Rome's secret architects. Just take a look at this symbol, the fasces. It represents the power of the state, the power to command and the power to punish. For the Romans, this was the ultimate symbol of authority. Their magistrates carried it everywhere. But here's the twist. It wasn't a Roman invention. Archaeologists found the very first physical evidence of a fasces, not in Rome, but in an Etruscan tomb in a town called Vecellionia. This is basically the smoking gun. It proves that this iconic symbol of power came from the Etruscans, and the Romans just adopted it as they grew more powerful.
And what's really amazing is that this ancient Etruscan symbol of government didn't die with Rome. Not at all. It was revived centuries later, and now it's all over the civic architecture of the United States, from the House of Representatives to the Lincoln Memorial, an Etruscan idea of power, still with us today.
But while Rome adopted their symbols of power, the most unique part of their culture, their actual voice, just faded away.
The Etruscan language wasn't related to Latin or Greek or any other language nearby. It was what we call an isolate, kind of a linguistic ghost, and its disappearance is a huge part of their mystery.
Now you'd think that with over 13,000 inscriptions, we'd have it all figured out, right? Well, there's a catch. Almost all of them are really short, repetitive funeral texts. You know, names and dates. It's like trying to learn English by only reading thousands of tombstones. It's incredibly hard to reconstruct the whole language from that.
You can actually watch the language slowly die out over a few hundred years. It didn't happen overnight. As Rome got bigger and stronger, Latin just started pushing Etruscan out. First, Rome conquers a big Etruscan city. Then you start seeing tombs with both languages. Then it's gone from coins. And finally, sometime in the early 1st century, the last person who knew how to write in Etruscan carved their final words, and the language went silent.
But not entirely. A few Etruscan words managed to survive, getting absorbed into Latin like faint echoes. And we still use some of them today. Words like arena, which comes from their word for sand, or person from their word for a theatrical mask. They're like these little linguistic fossils of a lost world.
So, after looking at all the evidence, what's the final verdict on this supposedly lost civilization? Did the Etruscans really just vanish off the face of the earth?
Well, here's the thing. They weren't erased. They were assimilated. That's the key. Their people, their ideas, their technology, it was all absorbed into the rising power of Rome. They became a fundamental, if often invisible part of the Roman world's cultural DNA.
Their legacy is totally concrete and undeniable. From engineering marvels like the arch, to religious rituals that shaped Roman belief, to symbols of power that traveled all the way from ancient Italy to modern Washington, D.C., and even as some of the words we speak, the Etruscan world didn't die, it just transformed and lived on.
Which leaves us with a final thought. This story of the Etruscans shows us that civilizations are rarely ever truly lost. They just become layers, foundations, and echoes within the cultures that come after them. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other lost worlds are still living, quietly and unseen, inside our own?